You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
What's something you learned in history class that you feel like wasn't the whole truth? Better yet, what's something you didn't learn at all that was omitted completely? That's what I like to call redacted history. My name is Andre White, the host of the Redacted History Podcast, the place where history's forgotten events, heroes, and villains get their story told, one episode at a time. The Redacted History Podcast. Real history never dies. Stream the Redacted History Podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever else you get your podcasts.
Hey everyone, welcome to episode number 254 of our Civil War podcast. My name is Rich.
And I'm Tracy. Hello y'all. Thanks for tuning into the podcast. As y'all recall, at the end of last week's episode, Fighting Joe Hooker had just been given command of the Army of the Potomac, and although the extremely ambitious Hooker had made no secret of his desire to succeed Ambrose Burnside, there's little doubt that on January 27, 1863, Hooker found himself in command of perhaps the saddest, angriest, and most grumbly Union army that ever took the field during the Civil War.
The sources of discontent that so afflicted the Army in January 1863 went far beyond simple defeat on the battlefield. But Lincoln's decision to remove Burnside marked the start of a new chapter for the Army of the Potomac. The president's primary purpose was to restore the Army's morale and appoint a commander who might earn its confidence. Although Lincoln couldn't erase the rank-and-file's devotion to Little Mac or numerous officers' admiration for their former commander, he could, and did, eliminate the idea that he would ever again give McClellan command of the Army.
Because in Hooker, Lincoln had given one of McClellan's harshest critics command of the Army. In addition, Lincoln had underscored the point that it would be the president, not an Army commander, who would shape Union war aims. In short, there would be no turning back from his commitment to the restoration of the Union and the emancipation of slaves.
Nevertheless, Abraham Lincoln had taken a chance by elevating Hooker to Army command. The president had heard the stories about the general's alleged sordid reputation with his fondness for liquor and women, including prostitutes. Lincoln probably also knew about the deep and long-standing hostility between Hooker and General-in-Chief Henry Halleck. And within the Army, Hooker's vanity and boastfulness hadn't endeared him to his fellow generals. Inordinate ambition seemed to define Hooker, as he shamelessly courted newspaper correspondents and congressmen, enhancing himself by undermining others.
Lincoln realized, however, that no other general in the Army had the standing of Hooker. Fighting Joe had endeared himself to radical Republicans in Congress with his condemnation of McClellan. On battlefields, he had been aggressive and energetic, with unquestioned personal bravery. He was popular with the troops he had commanded and enjoyed their respect.
Weighing the pros and cons of Hooker's appointment, Lincoln obviously decided the pros outweighed the cons. But the president also must have concluded that the situation called for him to state his position plainly. So when Lincoln met with Hooker, he handed him a remarkable letter. In it, the president praised Hooker's bravery, skill, and self-confidence, but then he went to the heart of the matter, pointing out that while Burnside had commanded the Army, quote, "You have taken counsel of your ambition and thwarted him as much as you could, in which you did a great wrong to the country."
Lincoln continued, writing, "I have heard in such a way as to believe it, of your recently saying that both the Army and the government needed a dictator. Of course, it was not for this, but in spite of it, that I have given you the command. Only those generals who gain successes can set up dictators. What I now ask of you is military success, and I will risk the dictatorship."
Lincoln pledged the administration's support, but Hooker should realize, he warned, that, quote, "the spirit which you have aided to infuse into the Army, of criticizing their commander and withholding confidence from him, will now turn upon you. I shall assist you as far as I can to put it down. Neither you nor Napoleon, if he were alive again, could get any good out of an army while such a spirit prevails in it."
Lincoln had passed through a difficult, challenging time as the calendar turned from 1862 to 1863. There was the disaster at Fredericksburg, the crises in the cabinet and the Army of the Potomac, and the protest against his Emancipation Proclamation.
In addition, out west, Grant's campaign against Vicksburg had come to nothing and resulted in a bloody repulse at Chickasaw Bluffs on December 29th. Only in Tennessee, as the old year gave way to the new, could the Federals claim a military victory at Stone's River. And so for now, Lincoln had to be patient with Hooker as he restored morale and prepared the Army of the Potomac for renewed campaigning come spring.
When Hooker assumed command, his appointment elicited mixed opinions from the rank-and-file soldiers. A New York officer described the troops' mood at the time by saying, quote, "An entire army struck with melancholy. Enthusiasm all evaporated. The Army of the Potomac never sings, never shouts, and I wish I could say, never swears."
Hooker started by addressing the two most pressing concerns, desertion and the men's physical needs. When Hooker took command, 29% of the Army was absent, half without leave. 200 more were gone each day. A soldier claimed that deserters, quote, "had the good wishes of the whole regiments, almost without exception. Men here attach no disgrace to desertion."
Hooker ordered the Army's provost marshal, Brigadier General Marcena Patrick, to hunt down deserters and to tighten the cordon around the Army's encampments. Hooker also implemented a system of furloughs that proved to be enormously popular. Soon there was a continual stream of officers and men going home and returning from leave. By April, Hooker's efforts had yielded an 18% drop in the number of men absent from the Army.
Sensing that low morale of the Army was also due in part to its collective health, Hooker also attended to the physical condition of the troops. His primary agent of change in this area was the Army of the Potomac's medical director, Jonathan Letterman. Writing of Letterman after the war, Hooker offered uncommonly unrestrained praise, saying, quote, "I doubt if any army has had his superior in technical and profound knowledge of his profession, and in administrative ability and devotion. Many a man in that army was indebted to him for their lives, without even knowing it."
To a modern person, the measures Letterman enacted in February and March seem fundamental. For example, since he subscribed to the belief that there was a correlation between hunger and health and happiness, he urged improvement in the men's diet. Burnside had neglected the troops' welfare, and for weeks they had subsisted on hardtack and salt pork. Through Hooker, Letterman ordered bakeries constructed, and soon the smell of fresh bread drifted across the encampments. By mid-February, one soldier in a New York regiment spoke for many when he declared that, quote, "Fighting Joe is becoming a favorite with us because he has ordered that we shall have fresh bread 4 days a week. Bravo for Joe Hooker."
Letterman also prompted the regular provision of vegetables, which were supplied in the camps at least twice per week in February. Sanitation also improved under Letterman's direction. He mandated the rotation of campsites, the removal of latrines from living areas and the vicinity of water sources, and the regular airing of tents, huts, and bedding. In early April, he even persuaded Hooker to order every soldier in the Army to wash both their clothes and themselves. Those who failed to do so were arrested. This prompted a grudging compliment from a formerly dubious artilleryman who admitted, "General Hooker is bound to have this army start forth in good style, with clean clothes at least."
These measures produced dramatic results. In February alone, cases of diarrhea in the Army dropped 32%, typhoid 28%. Scurvy, which had been common in January, virtually disappeared by April. Between February 1st and March 28th, only 800 men left the Army due to illness.
Another fundamental grievance had been lack of paychecks. Regiments and batteries hadn't seen a paymaster for months. On the last day of February, though, the men mustered for the distribution of 4 months' pay, which silenced another complaint.
The most famous of Hooker's measures concerned corps badges. Although these simple symbols eventually would become prized possessions of both their original owners and later collectors, their origin was actually found in a negative motivation. You see, Hooker's original intent was to reduce straggling while on the march and shirking during battle, since with each officer and soldier wearing a distinctive badge on his cap, he could be returned more rapidly to his unit. At any rate, although Phil Kearny's old division in the 3rd Corps had been proudly wearing their red badges for months, by mid-April the rest of the Army received their badges, which were initially either cotton or flannel.
Despite his disdain for his predecessors in Army command, Hooker didn't hesitate to steal their ideas. For example, Hooker's practice of staging regular inspections and reviews had been a favorite device used by McClellan to encourage the Army to see itself in a positive light. Now, under Hooker, a 12th Corps soldier noted, quote, "Inspecting and reviews are the orders of the day. We have had no less than 6 within the last 3 weeks."
The grandest review occurred during the first week of April, when President and Mrs. Lincoln and their son Tad visited the Army of the Potomac. For 3 days, the presidential party was with the Army, and their presence provoked a small flood of commentary from the rank and file. The men especially noticed the president's evident weariness. Private William Wiley of the 70th New York wrote, "I really pitied him, and today I have a greater love and respect for him than I ever had before."
The Lincolns visited hospitals, and Hooker hosted a dinner for them and the Corps commanders. Tad Lincoln, who celebrated his 10th birthday during the visit, seemed to enjoy himself immensely, riding on a pony beside his father at the Grand Review.
By the time of the Lincolns' visit, the fighting spirit of the Army had been restored. Hooker's attention to the men's basic needs and his reforms had dispelled the dark shadow of demoralization. One soldier believed that Hooker's management had been, quote, "almost magical."
The weeks after Fredericksburg had marked the drop to rock bottom of the Army's morale. That demoralization had boiled to the surface in the gloom found in their letters and diaries, acts of insubordination, and the rampant desertion. Beneath the unhappiness, though, lay one of the Army of the Potomac's defining characteristics, and that was resiliency. They had passed through Fredericksburg's slaughter, endured serious shortages of food and clothing, and witnessed the reshaping of Union war aims with the Emancipation Proclamation. They had clamored for a change in commanders, and fled the ranks by the thousands. But the majority had stayed, steeled by a belief in a cause that transcended their sufferings and defeats, and braced by a commitment to duty and to each other. Joe Hooker did for the Army of the Potomac after Fredericksburg what McClellan had done for it after Second Bull Run. each in his own way, made the army strong enough and self-confident enough to endure the terrible tests to come.
Did archaeologists discover Noah's Ark?
Is the rapture coming as soon as the Euphrates River dries up?
Does the Bible condemn abortion?
Don't you wish you had a trustworthy academic resource to help make sense of all of this?
Well, I'm Dan Beecher, and he's award-winning Bible scholar and TikTok sensation Dr. Dan McClellan, and we want to invite you to the Data Over Dogma podcast,
where our mission is to increase public access to the academic study of the Bible and religion, and also to combat the spread of misinformation about the same.
But, in a fun way.
Every week we tackle fascinating topics, we go back to source materials in their original languages,
and we interview top scholars in the field.
So whether you're a devout believer,
or you're just interested in a clear-eyed, deeply informed look at one of the most influential books of all time,
we think you're going to love the Data Over Dogma podcast,
wherever you subscribe to awesome shows.
History never says goodbye. It just says, see you later. Edward Galeano was right when he said that. Events keep happening over and over again in some form. And that's the reason I produced the podcast, My History Can Beat Up Your Politics. What is it? We take stories of history and apply them to the events of today to help you, perhaps, understand them better. We are also part of Airwave Media Network. I've been doing the program since 2006. That's a long time, and the show has a long name. My History Can Beat Up Your Politics. Find me wherever you get podcasts.
As for the generals' revolt, well, with the conspirators either removed from the army or with their identities revealed, a comparative calm would settle on the Army of the Potomac's high command for about 3 months.
With self-confidence and energy, Hooker began an overhaul of the Army's command structure. On February 5th, he did away with the grand divisions and returned to the Corps organization that had previously been in place. And for the first time in the Army's history, Hooker organized the mounted units into a cavalry corps. With the transfer of the 9th Corps to the Western Theater, the Army of the Potomac's command structure now consisted of 7 infantry and 1 cavalry corps.
The commanders of the 7th Infantry Corps reflected the command changes that the Army had undergone during the previous weeks and months. Gone from the Army was every general except one who either had led a corps on the peninsula or had served in John Pope's Army of Virginia. They had owed their rank and post to seniority in the pre-war army, to political influence, and to Little Mac's favoritism. Now, for the most part, their successors had earned their commands through merit, and a turning point had been reached at the senior command level in the Army of the Potomac.
5 of the major generals had commanded a corps before Hooker replaced Burnside. John Reynolds, 1st Corps,
Darius Couch, 2nd Corps,
George Meade, 5th Corps,
Franz Sigel, 11th Corps,
and Henry Slocum, 12th Corps.
Reynolds and Couch had led their corps at Fredericksburg, while Burnside had appointed Meade after the battle. All 3 of them held conservative views, opposed McClellan's removal, but had avoided the internal bickering and kept their comments private.
Sigel's and Slocum's corps had been posted elsewhere in Virginia and weren't with the Army at Fredericksburg. Sigel was a politically powerful figure in the German-American community and had held corps command under John Pope during the Second Bull Run campaign. A staff officer noted that Sigel's 11th Corps, quote, is like a German settlement. The troops' proud boast was, I fights mit Sigel.
But Sigel complained that his undersized command wasn't worthy of his stature and asked to be relieved in February. Weeks later, to the surprise of the officers and men in the 11th Corps, Hooker assigned Oliver Otis Howard to lead the predominantly German units. No one could doubt Howard's personal bravery. He was a Maine Yankee who had lost his arm on the peninsula and had led his division against Marye's Heights, but his assignment to command 11th Corps wasn't a good fit.
Howard took his religion seriously, so much so that the men started to call him Old Prayer Book, and the fun-loving and free-thinking Germans quickly resented Howard's attempt, quote, to make a Sunday school class of a military organization, end quote. Their choice had been Major General Karl Schurz, who, like Sigel, had been a revolutionary émigré from Germany. But although Schurz was popular with his fellow Germans, he, like Sigel, lacked the capability for corps command.
Slocum, a West Pointer, had led a division on the peninsula and had been rewarded with the 12th Corps in October 1862. With his command deployed south of Washington, D.C. until February 1863, he'd been spared from the internal turmoil among the Army's generals.
Like Slocum, John Sedgwick owed his promotion to command the 6th Corps to battlefield leadership. He was wounded on the peninsula and again at Antietam, where his division had been routed in the West Woods. But the fault there had been more Bull Sumner's than Sedgwick's.
The 6th Corps was the largest in the Army and had been Franklin's old command. In time, the likable and unassuming Sedgwick would become one of the Army's most popular generals. To his men, he was Uncle John.
The most colorful and controversial new corps commander was Major General Daniel Sickles. Before the war, he had been a New York City lawyer, Tammany Hall Democratic politician, confidential secretary to James Buchanan when the future president served as ambassador to Great Britain, and Sickles had been a congressman. He was quick-witted, willful, brash, and ambitious, with pliable morals and principles.
In 1852, a 32-year-old Sickles had married a 16-year-old beauty. 7 years later, while a member of Congress, Sickles shot and killed Philip Barton Key, his wife's lover and son of Francis Scott Key, the writer of The Star-Spangled Banner. Defended by a team of lawyers led by Edwin Stanton, Sickles pleaded temporary insanity, the first defendant to do so in an American court, and was acquitted.
On the peninsula, Sickles led a brigade of New Yorkers in Hooker's division, earning their respect and affection. He missed the battles of Second Bull Run and Antietam, but when he rejoined the Army before Fredericksburg, he assumed command as senior brigadier of Hooker's former division of the 3rd Corps. Hooker's subsequent assignment of the Corps commander, George Stoneman, to the newly created cavalry force left Sickles as the Corps' ranking officer. His appointment as 3rd Corps commander was supposed to be temporary, but Lincoln, who appreciated the services of this former Democratic congressman, nominated him for a major generalcy. Professionals within the Army attributed Sickles' rise to his friendship with Hooker and to his skill as a political operator.
As Rich mentioned just a moment ago, Sickles' promotion resulted from Hooker's most important and far-reaching organizational change, the formation of a cavalry corps. Before this, for nearly 2 years, the Federal mounted units had been parceled out to infantry commands and had been no match for Jeb Stuart's Confederate horsemen. Stuart's raids through the rear of the Union Army had embarrassed the Yankee troopers and had demonstrated the superiority of rebel horse soldiers.
Recently, during the week between Christmas and New Year's, Stuart's veteran troopers had struck between Washington and the Army of the Potomac's encampments at Falmouth, and had escaped virtually unharmed. Now, though, Hooker took the initial step in rectifying McClellan's and Burnside's neglect and misuse of the Army's mounted arm.
George Stoneman's appointment to command of the newly created Cavalry Corps brought the 40-year-old West Pointer back to the mounted arm of the Army. He had served as McClellan's chief of cavalry, but his duties had been limited to administrative matters. Now he would have tactical control of the Army's cavalry units and was promoted to Major General in March 1863.
Stoneman declared a cavalry officer was, quote, "the very best selection that could have been made in the whole Army. We are glad to get him again, and he is glad to come back to his old position." Another officer, Captain Charles Francis Adams of the 1st Massachusetts Cavalry, stated, quote, "Stoneman we believe in. We believe in his judgment, his courage and determination. We know he is ready to shoulder responsibility and that he will take good care of us." That may have all been true, but it was also true that Stoneman was plagued by a severe case of hemorrhoids that would make any time he spent in the saddle excruciating.
Stoneman's mounted corps consisted of 3 divisions of volunteer regiments and a reserve brigade of regular Army units, in all 26 regiments and 3 companies of Federal horsemen. Brigadier Generals Alfred Pleasanton, William Averill, and David Gregg commanded the divisions, while John Buford led the reserve brigade.
Pleasanton seemed to owe his position more to relentless self-promotion than to demonstrated skill as a cavalry commander.
Averill was a career horse soldier, but he was guided by the principles of careful preparation and cautious tactics while serving in a part of the Army that favored the bold.
Gregg was a solid, unpretentious officer who, in the words of one of his subordinates, was, quote, "brave, prudent, dashing when the occasion required dash, and firm as a rock." End quote. Gregg's troopers called him Old Reliable.
The 4 regiments of regulars went to the extremely capable John Buford. A Kentuckian and West Pointer, Buford had led a brigade under Pope and had served as chief of cavalry under McClellan in the fall of 1862. A staff officer later said, quote, "We certainly had no cavalry officer equal to him, and I doubt whether he had many superiors in any respect." End quote. Although his rank entitled him to a division, Buford preferred command of the regulars in the reserve brigade, and the regulars wanted him.
Stoneman inherited a command that had been misused, lacked an identity, but possessed a smoldering fighting spirit. Hooker expected Stoneman to act aggressively and to confront the vaunted rebel horsemen.
The cavalry chief secured single-shot, breech-loading carbines for each of his troopers, instituted daily drills, ordered the study of mounted tactics by commissioned and non-commissioned officers, and saw to the replacement of worn-out horses.
Well, it wouldn't be long before the Army's mounted arm had a chance to prove their new worth, because on March 17th, St. Patrick's Day, Federal horsemen would tangle with rebel troopers in an engagement at Kelly's Ford, which turned into, quote, "a square, stand-up cavalry fight."
That means it's time for this episode's book recommendation. And our recommendation this time is Lincoln's Men, How President Lincoln Became Father to an Army and a Nation by William C. Davis.
The visit that Abraham Lincoln made to the Army of the Potomac that we talked about in this episode kind of jogged our memories with regard to this book. And we dug it out and dusted it off and remembered that we'd enjoyed it. So, well, here you go. It's our book recommendation for this episode. That's Lincoln's Men, How President Lincoln Became Father to an Army and a Nation by William C. Davis.
Don't forget you can find all of our book recommendations at the podcast website, which is www.civilwarpodcast.org.
Also at the website, you can start the process of enlisting in the Strawfoot Brigade, just like DeSander and Paul and Terry did this past week.
Thanks, y'all.
With our next show, we're going to cover the St. Patrick's Day clash at Kelly's Ford. But, dear listeners, that next show will not be next weekend, since Tracy will be out of town visiting family, and I'm going to see what kind of trouble I can get into while she's not here.
Wait, what?
So anyway, if you are listening in real time, that means episode number 255 won't be out until the weekend of October 28th. So there you go. But thanks for listening to this episode of The Civil War, 1861 to 1865, a history podcast. Tracy and I do hope you'll join us again next time, but until then, take care.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.